I've had a lot of conversations, both with people who haven't started programming yet, as well as people who are earlier in their software engineering journeys. And one of the most common topics that comes up is about all the different programming language these folks are trying to learn. After all, the more languages you can use, the better software engineer you are, right? Well, not really. In this video, I'm going to be talking about why that isn't quite true, and what a better approach might be in order to maximize your time and your career. Before we get into the weeds, let's zoom out a bit and think about what we're trying to accomplish here. While there's certainly nothing wrong with wanting to learn more languages, most people probably aren't learning more languages purely for the sake of knowing more languages. There's probably a different end goal out there. For a lot of people, that end goal is likely being able to land their first or maybe even second software job. With that sort of framing in mind, let's now talk about why learning many languages might not quite be the right tactic to use to achieve that end goal. 1. Mastery takes time. You might realize this already, but learning a programming language is hard. It takes time and effort. It can take months or even years just to become decent at a language, let alone great or an expert. If you only have this surface level understanding of programming languages, it becomes fairly difficult to develop the mental frameworks for approaching and breaking down different programming problems, let alone translating these thoughts into working, readable, and performant code. Using myself as an example, at this point in my career, I'm pretty good at Java. And that's really the only language that I can say that for. I started using Java in college for various class projects and exams, and then used it for many years of my career when I was working as an engineer on Android apps. I've used a bunch of different languages throughout my career. Python, Objective-C, Swift, C++, JavaScript. The list honestly goes on, but at the end of the day, if I have to go back to any programming language, it's always Java. Now, a reasonable question you might have is whether this single language, in my case Java, can be used for approaching every problem that comes up in your programming career. Technically, the answer might be you could, but I wouldn't really recommend it because certain languages are good for attacking particular problems. Not to mention, if you're working, let's say, in a code base that's entirely in C++, and you go in and you decide you want to write some Java, you'll get some understandable pushback. Which brings me to my second point, which is language skills are transferable. Once you've built a solid foundation in one language, it becomes much easier to pick up new languages. This might feel like a bit of a counterpoint to that first point I made, but they actually go hand in hand really well. Not to get too philosophical here, but programming language is a tool to solve problems. It's a way to express our human thought in a way that machines can understand. So when we learn a programming language for the first time, really we're learning how to try and solve problems. As an example, let's take a fairly basic self-contained programming problem. Reversing a string. That is, we'll have a sequence of characters and we want to return those characters but in reverse order. Although my best language is Java, I won't actually need to use any language to describe my approach for how I'd solve this problem. The way I'd approach this problem is that I know I want to take an input string, let's say that's I like potatoes, and I want to return that but in reverse. And so the way I'd approach that is I would go to that first string, I like potatoes, and then take each character off from the back and put it at the beginning of a new string until I've gone through all characters in that first string. Now that we have that basic strategy down, let's see some code. Since Java is my best language, here's a solution in Java. That being said, I could also do it in Python, or C++, which I haven't touched in I think 8 or 9 years, or even Ruby, which I don't think I've ever touched until literally right now making this video. The point is, once you know one language fairly well, it becomes a lot easier to pick up new languages because you've conditioned your brain to approach problems and think in a structured way. Sure, there are intricacies for each language that will take time to learn and master, but the general problem-solving approach will remain the same, regardless of which tool, in this case language, you choose to employ. Now for reason number 3. You only need one language to interview. Now, admittedly, this may be a bit of a purely tactical reason, but I still think it's worth mentioning. I've been on both sides of the interviewing table many hundreds of times. Have I reached 1,000? I'm not sure. Probably not, but I wonder if it's worth making a counter. Anyways, that aside, If you interview for a software job, likelier than not, you're going to be asked to solve a self-contained programming problem. An example of one of these is that reversing string problem I did a little bit earlier, although admittedly that's a bit of an easy one. As a side note, I have many feelings about these types of interviews and could probably record an entire video series about those feelings. But at least for the foreseeable future, they'll be a common way that companies will evaluate candidates for software positions. In literally every single one of these programming interviews, the candidate has complete control over what language they choose to use, regardless of the interviewer's familiarity with that language. The interviewer could honestly not know the language at all, and that's still okay. Really, it's more about the comfort of the candidate and what puts them at ease. You can and probably should use the same programming language for every interview you experience, because once you have that general problem-solving approach down, using the same language will make it easier to take the general approach you have in your head and translate that into the syntax of whatever language you're using. More familiarity with the language and its APIs just leads to one less area to worry about in a high-stress environment like an interview. I actually broke this rule one time earlier in my career when I decided to use Python in an interview because it was the hot language that all my friends were using. I was able to pretty clearly explain my thoughts on how I'd approach the problem, but then when it came down to actually translating those thoughts into code, I realized I just didn't know how to write Python code. I think I wrote some mix of Java and Python together, and it was all a mess. Needless to say, I did not do well in that interview. I didn't get that job, and I wouldn't quite recommend that approach. Last but not least, reason 4. Specialization can lead to cash money. This likely applies a little bit later in your software career, around the time when senior, staff, and principal titles start getting thrown around. But hey, it doesn't hurt to look a little bit into the future. I mentioned earlier that when we're learning our first programming language, we're really more focused about learning that problem-solving skill set and frameworks. However, once you've reached that point, once you've gotten a fair handle of a problem-solving approach and a language, and you're further into your software career, you might wonder, how do I advance this career, and how does my compensation, increase as my career advances? The very basic way of making more money is by providing value. If you're the go-to expert that everyone turns to when they're facing issues, chances are you're providing high value to that company and you'll be compensated accordingly. Specializing in the language is one way to reach that level of expert. Let's say, for example, you're working in a company that has a Python code base and you've been working in Python for several years. Maybe you've even contributed to changes to the language itself. You're setting yourself up well as an expert that both can contribute a lot individually as well as level up everyone else around you who might not be as experienced. So these are some of the reasons why I think learning multiple programming languages at once isn't the best use of your time to achieve personal success. Of course, I love hearing from others, so feel free to drop a comment whether you agree or disagree with any part of this video. Thanks for making it all the way here to the end. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.